Hello, my name is Meg Huang. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Connected Health Policy. In today's video, we'll be talking about the proposed physician fee schedule for 2024. This video is being recorded on July 24, 2023, so please note the date because information can change the later the date becomes. Before we get started, a couple of quick disclaimers. Please know that any information provided in today's talk is not to be regarded as legal advice. It is strictly for informational and educational purposes. CCHP always recommends that you consult with legal counsel if you are interested in a formal legal opinion. And also, if I happen to mention a company or show a picture of a product, know that neither I nor CCHP has any type of relevant financial interest, arrangement, or relationship with such a company. A bit of background about CCHP. We were actually started as a California telehealth policy organization back in 2009 as a program underneath the Public Health Institute. An opportunity to become the federally designated National Telehealth Policy Resource Center through funding through HRSA became available in 2012. CCHP applied for that. We got that funding. We've been serving in that capacity ever since. We also act as the administrator for the National Consortium of Telehealth Resource Centers. National Consortium of Telehealth Resource Centers are made up of the 14 telehealth resource centers who are underneath the same funding stream that CCHP is for our federal work. There are two national centers. CCHP is the one on policy, and there is one on technology based out of Alaska. And there are 12 regional resource centers that cover specific states. I highly encourage you, if you have questions regarding telehealth, to reach out to your regional telehealth resource center. However, you can reach out to any of the telehealth resource centers and we'll be able to help you or direct you to the right person. Today, we'll be talking about the physician fee schedule that was issued by CMS earlier this month. So for those who are not familiar with how telehealth policy is developed, there are two routes in which that can be done. It's either through legislation or administrative and regulatory action. So legislation is bills passed by Congress and signed by the president. The most recent one that impacted telehealth policy on the federal level is the Consolidated Appropriation Act in 2023. On the administrative and regulatory level, you can do it through the physician fee schedule, which we'll be talking about today, or CMS has done things such as fact sheets, or there can be FAQs or notices by the administrating agencies or other agencies also proposing regulations. So what is the physician fee schedule? For those who are not familiar with it, it is a process that CMS uses to decide what policies will be in effect for Medicare in the following year. Any changes that they want to make to the Medicare program, they do it through this process. It's basically a regulatory process. So they make the proposals the year before they go into effect. So for 2024, they made their proposals this year in 2023. Typically, the proposals are made in July. There's 60 days for a public comment period. And then the final rules, the final policies are published usually around November, though sometimes it's been as late as early December. Then the policies go into effect January 1st of the following year, unless they are assigned like a different date for when they will go into effect. So for this year, CMS released their proposed changes for the physician fee schedule for all of their policies, and there were several things related to telehealth. So that was released about 2 weeks ago. What they did, just generally, were making necessary changes, regulatory changes that the legislation I mentioned earlier, the 2023 Consolidated Appropriation Act, required them to make. They also addressed some of the temporary waivers that were supposed to expire at the end of this year in 2023 to align with policies that were extended out to 2024. And those policies primarily were extended by the previous legislation I mentioned, the Consolidated Appropriation Act. Please note, though, that not all of the temporary waivers that are expiring in 2023 were addressed in physician fee schedule. So for those that weren't addressed, unless there's some sort of later guidance or there's a change made when they do their final proposals or their final rules, it's most likely that those temporary waivers that end in 2023 and have not been addressed will likely actually end this year. So they will not be extended through 2024. They also made a lot of clarifying statements on previous policies just to make sure that the general public understood what their policies were. And also they streamlined a couple of established processes that they have in there that we'll get into later. And then one thing that was required, again, by the 2023 Consolidated Appropriation Act is that they added marriage and family therapists and mental health counselors to their permanent list of eligible providers to use telehealth to provide services underneath the Medicare program, and that will start in 2024. Again, this change was made by legislation because CMS themselves cannot change the list of eligible providers who can provide telehealth or services via telehealth and be reimbursed by Medicare. That is in federal law, that policy, and it requires Congress to change that. That change of adding marriage and family therapists and mental health counselors was only possible because of the Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2023. So let's get into a little bit further detail of what they did on some of the bigger issues. So extension on eligibility for services that will be reimbursed. So for those who are not familiar with it, there is a permanent list of services that the Medicare program will cover if they are delivered via telehealth. Now, when COVID-19 hit, what CMS also did were add additional services onto that permanent list. So there was also a temporary telehealth eligibility list of services. The question was, are these temporary codes going to stick around through 2024? We knew that they were going to stick around through 2023 because of the previous year physician fee schedule. Question is, will they continue on to 2024? And these were the codes that CMS has said, like, yes, these will continue on through 2024. So you have codes related to deep brain stimulation therapy codes, hospital care, emergency department and hospital codes, and cardiovascular and pulmonary rehab codes as well too. They are also adding as new codes through 2024, health and well-being services. So these two codes will be available through 2024. And then to the permanent list of codes, they are adding a new code. It doesn't have an exact service code number yet, so it's just GXXX5, but it's Administration of Standardized Evidence-Based Social Determinants of Health Risk Assessments, 5 to 15 minutes. If the code is finalized. So it will be added to the permanent list, but they're still waiting for this code to be finalized. So these are the changes to the list of eligible services that we will see through at least 2024, or in the case of GXXX5 will be on the permanent list if the code is finalized. What they also did around the services was streamline their approval process. Again, for those who may not be familiar with it, the current process that CMS has for deciding which codes to put on the permanently eligible list for telehealth delivery is a process where the code has to pass one of two tests. So a category 1 test, where if CMS finds that the code is very similar to like a code that's already on the permanent list, then it will pass that test and be put on the permanent list. Or if the code has substantial evidence to show that it's similar to what the service would have been provided in person if you have received it via telehealth. So there has been a lot of confusion, I think, with like what would qualify for category 2. So CMS decided to really streamline this process, to alleviate some of that confusion for the public and make it easier for them to understand when they submit a suggestion for the code to be on permanent list, and also to alleviate probably CMS's administrative burden of like going through this. And what the new streamlined process would be is they're eliminating sort of this category 1 and category 2 tests and just having more of a 5-step process in how they go about approving codes. First, they'll look at, is it a separately payable service? So basically, does Medicare cover the service to begin with? Is the service subject to provisions under 1834M? Basically, can some part of the service use telehealth to substitute for that in-person or face-to-face requirement? Then they'll review the elements of the service in the definition of those codes and determine if it can be done via telehealth. They'll map the elements of the proposed service to one that's similar to what already is on the permanent list. So that's very similar to the category 1 test, and that is it similar to something that's already on the permanent list? If it is, then great, it can go on the permanent list. It passes like this process. If it can't meet that requirement, you go to step 5, and what it says is that, they'll consider then the evidence, so something very similar to their category 2 test, they'll consider the evidence of clinical benefit to see if it's enough to push them onto the permanent list. And then, if they think that there's not enough evidence yet, but there could be sufficient evidence for further study, they'll put it on provisional status. So another way that this sort of differs from like the previous process was they had a category 1 or category 2 test. So you were either in or out, depending on whether you could pass one of the two tests. Here with their streamlined process, they now have created sort of another category, a temporary category of like, we'll look at you further if we think there could be like further evidence to show that you can be moved on to the permanent list. And for those who have followed telehealth pretty closely, that may sound familiar to you. That may sound like category 3, which it essentially kind of is. And for those who aren't familiar with it, in addition to these two tests, a couple of years ago during the pandemic, CMS created this holding bucket called category 3, where they said, these are temporary codes that we think have promise, but we need more time to gather evidence. So we put them in category 3. That was also something that was going to expire in 2023. So they've like accommodated that or adjusted for that by creating this new streamlined process on how to approve services. And now it becomes essentially step 5. So this is a change that will go into effect in 2024. So next year, when we have our 2024 physician fee schedule, proposed physician fee schedule, we'll probably see this process go into effect. The other thing, a major thing that they have changed is facility rate versus non-facility rate. So during the public health emergency, when people were pivoting towards telehealth and practitioners were servicing patients from their home, CMS were paying those practitioners the non-facility rate. For those who may not be familiar, basically the difference is the non-facility rate actually pays higher than the facility rate. So when the practitioners were getting the non-facility rate, even though they were treating the patients in their home, it's because CMS viewed that as, well, aside from if we didn't have the pandemic, those interactions would have taken place in the facility to begin with. So yes, we're going to pay this higher rate of the non-facility rate. CMS has decided that they will continue that when the practitioner is treating the patient in the home. They will continue to pay that practitioner the non-facility rate, so the higher rate. Now, where this was really interesting is the reasoning that they gave to continue to pay this non-facility rate was that they acknowledged that there are still some costs that the practitioner will have, even though that they are treating the patient via telehealth and the patient's at home, that the practitioner likely will still have overhead costs, such as like maintaining an office space and so forth. So that was important to like keep the reasoning in mind and the way that they phrased that, because there are a couple things there. They talked about practitioners. So this does not sound like they were talking about facilities such as hospitals continuing to receive the non-facility rate versus facility rate. So they were talking about practitioners, and they were also talking about practitioners that made it sound like these were practitioners they considered who still had a brick and mortar office of some sort, of some actual location where they would still continue to be able to see patients in person. So maybe, though they did not explicitly say this, maybe they were not really considering practitioners that were 100% seeing patients via telehealth. Now, would they be excluded from this? That was not clear. They have just simply said in their proposal that you were to bill the POS 10, which signifies that your patient was in the home during the telehealth interaction, and you would receive the non-facility rate. That is all the physician fee schedule said. But I only like clarify these things or point these things out simply because I don't know if there will be sort of more information around that later. But just know in the physician fee schedule, they particularly were saying practitioners, and in their reasoning, they were talking a lot about overhead or like costs that the practitioner would have, even though they were using telehealth, because that they would have some sort of office still being able to see the patients in person. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. I don't know how they will, go about this. They may just simply, as they noted in the physician fee schedule, just look at it and note it that you billed POS 10, the patient was at home, and that's the end of the story. But just a couple of things to keep in mind. Supervision. So there were a couple of clarifying things about supervision. Again, this is one of the policies that were slated to end in 2023. So what they are proposing to do is continuing to allow some supervision via a live video to continue on through 2024. So they will allow the supervised practitioner to still be able to use live video for direct supervision and immediate availability to meet those requirements of that definition. And then for supervision of teaching students, to allow the teaching physician to continue to have a virtual presence in the teaching setting. But when it is a clinical instance, that clinical instance has to only be for services that are being furnished virtually. And this is all live video. So audio only is not going to qualify for this. This is like all live video for these supervising exceptions that they're making here. They will also be establishing a general policy supervision for PTs and OTs in private practice when they are supervising an assistant PT or an assistant OT who are providing remote therapeutic monitoring services. And that's basically because there's a definition conflict right now around direct supervision when you're talking about private practice. So CMS will be establishing a policy around that as well too. Specific details of that were not in the physician fee schedule. It's just a notation that they would be doing that. Diabetes self-management and medical nutrition. So for diabetes management training and medical nutrition training, institutional staff will be allowed through 2024 to provide training via telehealth to beneficiaries in their home. So they'll continue that for like another year. They also note that institutions that staff who are providing training may not actually be the ones that Medicare authorizes to do so. So they're saying that there will be exercising enforcement discretion on that. They also are proposing changing the billing rules to DSMT that would allow practitioners who appropriately report DSMT services furnished in person by the DSMT entity to report those services that are provided via telehealth, including when they are performed by others that are part of DSMT services. So basically, what this appears to be is if you have staff who are providing those DSMT services via telehealth, and they aren't normally the staff who are allowed to provide those services via telehealth, when the entity itself bills, as long as it's assigned to somebody who is eligible to do that, they will go ahead and continue to reimburse for it as well too. And also for the CMS Diabetes Management Training Program, they have said that they will continue that for an additional 4 years as well too. So some of the other proposals that are in the physician fee schedule, and I'll go through these really quickly. So telephone and evaluation management services, some of them are sticking around still through 2024. The originating site fee will now be $29.92 in 2024. They are allowing some of the frequency limitations to continue. Or to continue to be waived through 2024, and those are around inpatient visits, skilled nursing facilities, and critical care consultations. So for the telehealth injection training for insulin dependent, they're allowing telehealth to continue to be used in some instances, and then periodic assessment for opioid use disorder, they're continuing audio only to continue to be used through 2024. And then other things that they have done as well too. If you actually want more details regarding this, we have a CCHP fact sheet that is available. It dives a little bit more deeply into this than what I covered today, and a few other things that I did not cover on this particular presentation. So I highly recommend you go to CCHP's website to take a look at that fact sheet if you are interested in that information. But otherwise, I just wanted to thank you. Please subscribe to our newsletter for updates. Keep in mind that these are just proposals at the moment. There is still time to make comments on these proposals. If there is something that you wish to have clarified or you think should be different than what they are proposing, you need to get those comments into CMS by September 11th, 2023. I highly suggest that if you do wish to send in comments, that perhaps you aim for sending it in actually on September 10th, just to be certain that you make the deadline. But as of right now, again, these are only proposals. If you have some feedback that you wish to give CMS, send in your public comments before September 11th. And then the final rules will most likely be published in November this year, maybe as late as December, but probably most likely November. Thank you very much. I hope this video has been helpful for you. Again, this was recorded on July 24th, 2023, so there could be changes in policies if you are viewing this video at a later date. Have a great day.